My name is Jonathan Witmer-Rich. I'm a professor at the Cleveland State University College of Law, and I'm the co-director of our Criminal Justice Center.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking today about Cuyahoga County bail reform, and a task force that you led that produced a document called Cuyahoga County Bail Task Force Report and Recommendations. And I'd love for you to go through first and foremost how this task force came about and how you did your work.
Sure. So the task force was kind of organized by Judge John Russo. He was then the presiding and administrative judge of the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. And there was, I think a lot of public attention at that point. The Plain Dealer was running stories about bail reform. Some national organizations like the Arnold Foundation were really focusing on it, and I think still are. And so Judge Russo, was sort of, I think, thinking, well, how can we try to get some traction here in Cuyahoga County to take a look at what, if anything, we need to be doing differently. So he, formed a task force. Kind of at the beginning, it was very open process. It was sort of like, it was a public meeting, anybody could come, and at the meeting you could sign up to be on the task force. So it wasn't a limited group or anything like that. And they kind of created 4 different working groups within the task force to kind of focus on different areas. And I guess I would say that, there are advantages to having an open process like that where anybody can sign up. The disadvantage is that it's kind of hard to get things moving and actually make progress, because you just kind of, who's coming to which meetings, and people aren't coming, and what's happening between the meetings, and it's all a volunteer situation. So, I think that there were meetings and there was some evidence being gathered from different places around the country, and that was helpful, but we were kind of not making a lot of progress on actually getting to, say, a set of recommendations. So after a while, and I don't remember the timing exactly, but it went on for a number of months, and after a while, Judge Russo kind of approached some people who had been more involved, including me, to say, could you work on putting together, as a team, sort of like come up with a report, a draft at least of something that we can work on and try to see if we can get, move this process toward a resolution. So that's what we did. And ultimately, we did have a lot of meetings, discussion with a lot of different people in the room. But at the end of the day, then it was kind of a group of 4 of us who sat down and tried to distill the discussions and come up with a set of specific recommendations. So that's kind of how it worked. And I took the lead in drafting that, but other folks were certainly involved in having a lot of input into what the recommendations were.
Well, thank you. And thank you for doing the work too, because it's I think it's an important document still. Even though it was 2018, I think it was completed.
I think that's right.
So I would like to begin by giving a kind of a thumbnail sketch of what bail and pretrial detention looks like in Cuyahoga County back in 2018, and then we will eventually get to the current state. But if you could give us an overview of what it looked like, and then we can get into some of what you were proposing to change.
Sure. So one thing that was the case then is still the case now, that's a little bit, I think, strange for a lot of people is, so we've got 2 different court systems. We've got the municipal courts and we've got the common pleas court. The municipal courts handle misdemeanors, and there are municipal courts around the county, right? The Cleveland Municipal Court, the Shaker Heights Municipal Court, spread around in different cities, municipalities. Municipal courts do not have jurisdiction over felonies. So the more serious cases, felonies, are going to end up in common pleas court. But for kind of, I don't know, historical reasons, they almost always start in municipal court. So you'll have somebody charged with the felony in the Lakewood Municipal Court, and everybody knows it's going to end up in Cuyahoga County because it has to. The Lakewood Court can't adjudicate it. It's a felony. But it starts there, and the judge sets bail preliminarily, and then it's what we call bound over to the common pleas court, and a grand jury has to indict that person because it's a felony. And it can be a week or a couple weeks before it gets finally picked up by the common pleas court. So that happened then. It happens now. And one thing we say in the report is we think that's kind of an unfortunate way to run things, because it means that the court that's actually going to handle the case is not the court that takes it from day one. And that creates a lot of delays. And with respect to bail in particular, you have a judge setting bail in the case who's not actually going to hear the case. It's going to go out of their court very quickly. And that creates some weird incentives on how bail is handled. So, that's a feature that did happen, and it still happens today. And we recommended that, instead we go to kind of a centralized booking process where cases that are going to be felonies, let's just put those in the court where they're going to end up from the beginning. So that would be one way to streamline things a little bit. One problem with bail is the more delays you have very early in a case, the more you end up people spending time in jail who really don't need to be there, right? It just takes maybe a week or a couple weeks before person looks at their case and says, "Oh, you don't need to be here. Like, you're not dangerous. You don't need to be stuck in this jail." It's not good for them, and it's expensive for the taxpayer.
And I think that's the centralized bail hearing that you recommended.
Correct. Exactly. So I guess on that one, I don't think we've made a lot of progress. That would be a big lift. I mean, that's not something, you would need to really have all the judges and all the municipalities come together and agree to that, but it could be done. Absolutely. Some other things there has been more progress on. So for example, I think we recommended that certain lower level felonies where there doesn't appear to be, the type of case that really poses a danger to the community, that those cases people should just be released, what's called on their own recognizance. Why do they have to post money, right? We kind of are used to a system where you get arrested, you go into court, and you have to put some money up, right? You have to pay a surety, or you have to pay the court or something. And like, why, right? Why do we have to do that? A lot of places don't do that. And jurisdictions that have quit using money bail for lower level felonies generally find that it's unnecessary, right? And it's just sort of, in many cases, ends up being a tax on poor people, right? People with money find it easy to provide that money, and then they get most or all of it back. Poor people don't have the money, sometimes even a couple $100s, and they end up sitting in jail, and again, that's a tax on poor people. It has nothing to do with community safety or the efficient functioning of the court system. So I do think that the Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court has definitely made a shift there, where it's not uniform, but they have fewer money bail that they're putting on people with low level felonies. So I think there's been some improvement in that regard.
Yeah, and I do want to just back up on some of the terms you're using. I'd like you to tell us first what kinds of bail there are and how the offense determines what bail you're getting, and also how judges factor into it.
Sure. So, we think of somebody, you're arrested for a particular offense, and at the pretrial phase, in theory, we're not punishing you yet, right? Because you haven't been adjudicated guilty of anything. So there are two traditional rationales for putting restrictions on people's liberty pre-trial. The first is we need to make sure that you participate in the process. You show up for court, you attend your court dates, you don't skip town, right? So that's appearance. The second is danger to the community. In a lot of cases, there doesn't appear to be any danger to the community, but in some exceptional cases, you look at the charges, you look at the preliminary evidence, and you think, oh, this person really seemed to pose a serious danger to the community. So those are the two different considerations that might drive, judges to put restrictions on people. One unfortunate thing that we say in the report, and is still the case today, is that those two things often get treated at the same time, right? Is the person going to show up, and do they pose a danger? Kind of get talked about and put in the same bucket. And if you think of, money, that's only one, the variety of conditions. Judges have discretion. They can say, you have to check in with a pretrial services officer once a week, or you have to submit proof of your employment or proof of your, where you live. You can do different things. There are other things like putting somebody on like an ankle monitor or a location so they know where they are. Now those it depends. Some courts have those available and some don't. They don't have them in their budget, right? So there can be that issue. But in general, there are a lot of options. But the issue of like money, like that's the big one, right? Money is kind of a strange one when we think of like danger to the community, right? So if somebody is a danger to the community, they're a danger to the community, or they're not. I mean, the judge has got to make their best assessment. But if you put a $20,000 bond on that because you think they're dangerous, well, all that does is if they don't have a lot of money, then they're going to be detained because they can't afford the bail. But if they do have money, then they pay the money and they're released, right? So why is the money playing any role there, right? It's sort of like if somebody really is dangerous enough, and this is what we do in federal court, if somebody's really dangerous enough, you should order them to be detained. Like, I don't care how much money you have, you need to be in jail because you're too dangerous to the community. So using money to try to address danger to the community, it just doesn't really fit. And that's, I think, something unfortunate that happened with this, this citizen initiative a year or two ago, where essentially that was codified into law in Ohio, that the judge, when setting the amount of money bail, needs to take into account danger to the community. I mean, I think I can guess why people voted for that. People do think judges, pre-trial, should consider danger to the community. And frankly, I agree with that. But the problem is using money to address that, it's just a weird fit, right? It just means, I guess, dangerous people who have money get to be out, and dangerous people who don't have money have to be in jail. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it really doesn't. And I would love, I would like the next topic of ours to be pretrial services, because that's the kind of next finding in the paper. And tell us what pretrial services are, and then what the recommendations were to kind of streamline them and move them along.
Yeah, so pretrial services is the idea that, when somebody's arrested, if you're going to have options other than let's put this person in jail, let's impose a financial bond on them, other options that might better fit who they are and what their needs are would be to say, well, let's say we have a pretrial services department, and we have officers in that department who can do some preliminary investigation, right? A judge, when they're faced with a defendant very early on in a case, especially if it's a serious case at all, their problem might be that they don't have much information, right? The judge doesn't immediately know how stable is this person's employment. Where do they live? Who do they live with? Are there people living with them who they pose a danger to? All kinds of things, right? And if you have a pretrial services department who can investigate, they can inform the judge, first of all, just so the judge can make a more informed decision. And secondly, that pretrial services department can provide the judge with options. They can say, well, you know what, Your Honor, we can help this person get stable housing, which is something they currently lack, right? And if that's a reason why we're going to hold them in jail, why don't we try to just provide them stable housing? It's going to be cheaper to house them outside of the jail than to house them in the jail, right? And it's going to be, let's help them try to line up a job, right? Let's address is the person maybe with some addiction issues. Let's try to address the addiction issues because that's going to be a problem in this case, right? So providing those kind of services at the front end to help work out the things that might pose a problem for the person in terms of, being able to show up to court, having the court have confidence that they can release this person and nothing's, judges, frankly, in many cases are concerned. This person came in, they seem to have an addiction problem. I'm afraid if I let them go, they're going to overdose tomorrow, right? Like, I don't want that to happen. I'm trying to protect this person. But putting them in jail to protect them is not great for the person, and it's expensive for the community, right? It's not a very good way to try to address that problem. So the recommendation, broadly speaking, I would say would be just to try to enhance and broaden the availability of pretrial services. And that goes hand in hand with the other recommendation we already mentioned of trying to centralize this whole process, because like the city of Cleveland and Cuyahoga County have considerable resources, some of which they devote to pretrial services. But if you go to every little municipality around Cuyahoga County, a lot of them are just too small and don't have the budget to be like, oh yes, we have a couple full-time pretrial services officers and we have these resources available to us. Some courts simply don't have that in place. And so if you end up in that court, you're not going to be getting the pretrial services. So we think that if we consolidate that and do it at a centralized location, you would have more robust pretrial services. We think that's a good investment. Keeping people out of jail in the community, hopefully working, taking care of their kids, is 9 times out of 10 better for everyone involved than putting them in the county jail.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that I was struck by, and I've seen other statistics that are similar to this, but the amount of time people are actually held over in detention prior to even being charged, right? So this is they're waiting for their felony day in court. And one of the statistics you have is 25% of felony pretrial population was an average of 104 days. And I can imagine that's probably similar today, if not more. And when that's really hard to contemplate as a law-abiding citizen, that the state can hold you that long, even before you've had your day in court, per se. So can you explain how that works and why some people have to stay that long, other people, I mean, even 17 days for the 75%, that's over 2 weeks. You can lose a job, you can lose an apartment, you can lose kids, all sorts of things in 17 days. So what's the purpose of this and what's the outcome of some of it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I would say, in some cases, a long period of pretrial detention, first of all, some of those cases are going to be cases where you've got a very serious felony charge and the person is looking at a very long period in jail. And another, I guess, this becomes a little bit of a quibble, but in terms of detention, like I said, they might be sitting there on a big bail amount that they can't afford. If they really are dangerous, there is a statute in the Ohio Revised Code that authorizes judges to hold a hearing, make specific findings, and order someone detained, whether they have no money or whether they're a millionaire. Like, you can just order someone detained. Judges tend not to do that because if you just put a high dollar bail on somebody, then they get detained and you don't have to hold the hearing, right? It's an efficiency. But I think that would be something that it really makes much more sense to hold the hearing and order somebody detained if they really need to be detained. So people who are detained for a long period of time for that reason, that may be justified, right? They have they do appear to be a dangerous person, or they're a high risk of flight, and they're looking at a very significant time in prison if they are convicted. Those are some of those cases, but not all of them, right? And as you pointed out, even for very short periods or very short, it's really important at the very, very beginning of a case to make sure that we are not detaining people for even a couple days, for 17 days, for 2 weeks, right? People who do not need to be there. It really creates a lot of problems. One of the dynamics that can exist, which is really troublesome, and I don't think people are trying to do this on purpose, but it just happens, is you end up with a system where for low-level cases, people basically serve their sentence first and then are convicted, right? It's the opposite. It's like in Alice in Wonderland, the Queen of Hearts said, sentence first, trial second. You end up with a system like that, where a person is detained pre-trial because they can't afford a relatively small bail amount. And let's say 30 days in, they've been in jail for 30 days. The charge is not that serious of a charge. And they have a day in court, and the judge says, well, the prosecutor is offering, if you plead to this misdemeanor, you'll get credit for time served, and you'll walk out the courthouse this afternoon, right? You've already served your sentence. Or if you don't want to plead guilty, you're here on a more serious charge, then you still can't afford bail. You're going to stay in jail, right? That's an incredibly coercive system. And the result is that people end up pleading guilty to crimes that they're not guilty of, that they haven't committed, because it's sort of like, I'm being offered the chance to just walk out today. Most people will take that opportunity, right? So that's another really big danger of pretrial detention, right? Is creating a system where you basically require people to serve their sentence before they've been convicted, and then they just take the conviction because they've already done the time.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think a layperson hearing this automatically thinks, well, you're not going to get arrested and held if you're innocent. But you said you're confessing to a crime you didn't commit. Can you explain how the plea bargain system incentivizes pleading to things that you may not have done?
Sure. So, I'm just starting to teach criminal law to new law students this fall. And one thing I've assigned them and that we're discussing in class is there's a podcast that some of your listeners have heard about, the Serial podcast. And season 3 of that podcast came here and looked at Cuyahoga County in Cleveland. And at the very beginning of that, there's a story of a young woman who's given the pseudonym Anna, who kind of is being assaulted in a bar. She kind of gets into a bar fight. She ends up being arrested because while she's trying to kind of protect herself, she kind of flings her arm backwards, and the guy she hits is a police officer. So she ends up being arrested and charged with felony assault on a police officer. And there's a video from the bar that my students watch. You can find it online. And so far, almost to a person, every student who looks at that, whether they're a cop or a whatever, teacher, whoever they are, they say, well, that's ridiculous. Like, she didn't do anything wrong. When she hit the cop, it was accidental and she was acting in self-defense. Like, this is nothing. This case should be dismissed. But in our system, right, she's appointed counsel who's it was a very experienced lawyer. And, he represents her, I think, reasonably well. And he was willing to take the case to trial. And he thinks it would have won a trial. But at the very end, the prosecution is willing to knock it down to a very low misdemeanor from a serious felony, right? And the defendant is sort of like, I think I'm just going to take the minor misdemeanor, the relatively low misdemeanor, pay my fine. She had already spent 4 days in jail at that point because she was put on a $5,000 bond for a nothing kind of case, right? Why was she on a bond at all? Why did she spend 4 days in jail? So that kind of pressure, right? It should have been a case that the prosecution just dismissed. Or if it had been tried in front of a jury, she almost certainly would have been acquitted. I mean, you watch this and everybody says, oh, she didn't do anything wrong, acquittal. But because we don't really run a lot of jury trials in this country anymore, you just have this incredible pressure. Like, if I go to trial, I might get a felony charge here. That would be a disaster. I guess I'll just take this misdemeanor. I'm not going to get any more time in jail. I'll pay another couple $100s in fines. That's not a fair system, right? You're creating a system that's putting too much pressure on somebody to plead to something when they really didn't do anything wrong. And in that particular case, all of my students who watch that video, they say, oh, she was the victim in this case. She wasn't the perpetrator. Why is she the one pleading to a misdemeanor? So that's the kind of thing that can happen, and with the plea bargaining system. It creates those kind of pressures.
Well, and I think it also leads to a stacking of, because I've heard a statistic that once you've had a conviction or contact with the system, more likely than not, you're going to have more contact with that system, the criminal justice system. So how do previous charges and plea bargains and this kind of thing also factor into this risk assessment? And how can risk assessment tools change how we do bonds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this whole idea of risk assessment tools, I think, is a controversial subject. And I don't think it's something that we've come to an easy solution on. I mean, if you create, algorithms that kind of look at different factors to try to predict, ideally, an algorithm would predict not one thing, but two things, because again, we're talking about two different things. Is this person, do we think they're going to show up in court or not? And separately, do they pose a danger to the community or not, right? Those are two separate issues, and they're not that highly correlated, the research shows. But let's say we use an algorithm to do that. It's a very challenging thing to do. One issue is that prior convictions are very predictive algorithmically of people reoffending. And so if you create an algorithm, it is going to say, we want to put a fair amount of weight on prior convictions because that is a person who does pose a much higher risk of reoffending as opposed to somebody without that. Other people will respond to that and say, yeah, but you know, we don't have a neutral, impartial system in the first place. So if you start having people, you know, getting arrested, you know, getting targeted by the police more, and then having prior, you know, evidence in there, you know, they start triggering those algorithms and they start getting focused on, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. So I don't have an easy solution to that other than to say, you know, to try to make progress on the system, we have to think about what we currently have and how can we move forward. The traditional system, of course, is we didn't have algorithms, that we didn't you know, we didn't have any of that. And we relied on an individual judge's discretion to just say, here's what I think, right? That seems like, well, judges, I think, are trying to do their work in good faith. That seems like there are a lot of problems with that as well, right? These individual judges, while they're, even if they're trying to work in good faith, like they don't have an instant ability to just somehow magically read people and know if they're dangerous and know if they're going to be a flight risk. So there are risks to just relying solely on a individual judge's discretion. And one of those risks is that one judge versus another judge is going to exercise that discretion very, very differently. An algorithm that applies equally to everybody is going to introduce a level of like even the playing field to some degree. And that seems like a benefit. But again, as I said earlier, one downside is that, you know, it may just be amplifying earlier discretionary decisions that focus on certain populations, that, you know, certain communities. And so I don't think there's an easy solution there, but I think that's something that judges need to keep working with to try to figure out if they can improve the fairness and equitability of that decision making.
Yeah, and I think one of the, and the paper deals a lot with, the report and recommendations deals a lot with this risk assessment and the different types of domestic violence versus, you know, violent crime and all this kind of stuff, which I don't think we need to get into the minutia of that. But I would like to talk, before we move into the current state, of the idea of, it's the last section in the report about improved notice of hearings and quick access to bail and release. And I think one of the things that people don't, another piece that we don't think about unless we're in the system, is how you get notified if you're unstable housing, if you have or no housing, and how the court keeps track of you, or if it's your responsibility to keep track of the court.
Yes, that's a good way. That's a good way to frame it, right? And you know, it is challenging for a court that's dealing maybe with people who, like you said, they may not have stable housing and a stable mailing address and that sort of thing. A lot of people these days, most people these days have a phone, right? Not everybody, so that can create a problem as well. Not everybody has a consistent phone number, but a lot of people do. And I do think one thing that you know, is probably uneven around the county. And again, it's sort of like one municipality might do it one way, one municipality another. But to really try to, you know, take a perspective of like, everybody's going to be better off if the court does the best job it can do of making sure people know that they're having a hearing and figure out a way to get them to that hearing. And so, for example, there have been studies about if you send people text messages reminding them that they have a hearing tomorrow, that's much more effective than trying to like mail them a postcard, right? Most of those postcards aren't going to get to the right person. They aren't going to be seen. That's just not how people communicate anymore, right? So moving to a text message system can really improve people showing up, and doing some very simple things like making sure people, you know, providing access to bus passes, or, you know, if people need to be downtown at a courthouse, let's make it free for them to get there because we want them there. We think it's important that they be there to be able to adjudicate things properly. Let's not have that be an additional burden. Like, how do I get down there, right? So those are some, you know, potentially kind of simple things that could really improve, you know, the efficiency of the system. And I will note something that we don't really talk about in the report, but I've recently seen a new research project out of Philadelphia that talked about, well, people focus all the time on the defendant and the defendants appear in court, and that's an extremely important issue. But actually, there are other people who also need to appear in court, the witnesses, the prosecutor, and the police officers in many cases. And in this particular study in Philadelphia, they said, well, if we look at police officers, prosecutors, and witnesses versus, on the other hand, defendants, it's the prosecution side that is not appearing in court more often than the defendant, and that, continuances or whatever are necessary. The case gets delayed because those folks are not showing up in court. So I think it's actually important for judges to take a kind of holistic view of this, because I do think, keeping the system working efficiently, having hearings when you have a hearing scheduled, really important that defendants show up, equally important that everybody else shows up, right? And it's important to look at kind of across the board.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those other things that we have a popular sense that trials move, or these sorts of criminal justice hearings and procedures move very quickly, but it takes months and months and months and even years to get adjudicated sometimes on a crime that happened.
It can, yeah, it depends on the case, but right.
And so I want to move to, and maybe you could just briefly talk about in 2019. So your report comes out, and in 2019, the Supreme Court of Ohio did their own kind of investigation, correct? And they picked up a lot of what you said, right? And what do you remember what their findings were, what their main kind of crux was?
Yeah, so I mean, the Chief Justice at the time, Maureen O'Connor, was really focused on an issue that impacts people throughout the criminal justice system, which is, excessive fines and fees that kind of don't really serve a purpose, but end up creating problems for defendants and for the entire system. And this is one area where that shows up, right? Excessive bail. So she was really focused on that issue. And, there was a work on that at a variety of places in Columbus as part of the Ohio Rules Commission, which I was a part of the time, trying to draft some amendments to the Ohio Rules of Criminal Procedure related to how we did bail and pretrial release. And I would see that process wasn't entirely successful, but we did make some progress in kind of moving in what I think is a direction consistent with our report. And then the Ohio Supreme Court, at one point, interpreting that new rule, looked at it and said, yeah, we really should not have judges imposing financial bond because they think the person is a danger to the community. The route for that, as I said earlier, is to hold a hearing under this revised code provision, and you can order someone to be detained. You can just go to the, a detention order. But we shouldn't use excessive bail amounts as a kind of substitute for that. And I don't know, I mean, it depends how you explain this to people, but I think it's in many ways a pretty simple issue. We think of, we hear the phrase, it's in the Constitution, right? We can't deprive people of liberty without due process of law. Due process of law. What does that mean, right? It's kind of a mysterious phrase. But this is, I think, a really simple example of that. If you want to put someone in jail before they've been convicted of a crime, well, we should have some procedures in place, right? And that should be like a hearing where the person is represented by counsel and they can cross-examine the government's witnesses. And the judge has to make specific factual findings that can be reviewed on appeal if needed about why they think that person is dangerous. And that's all what the revised code provides, right? It is a pretty good system. But it's easier to not do that, right? It's faster, it's more efficient to simply post $1 million bail on someone and then they by default are detained rather than going through that system. So, the court was starting to kind of go down that path, and it issued a decision saying you shouldn't use financial conditions as a way to detain somebody because you think they're dangerous. And kind of the response to that was this petition that passed in a ballot initiative where it said, when you're setting the amount of money bail, you need to consider danger to the community. So that essentially reversed that Ohio Supreme Court decision. And again, I understand why people want judges to think about danger when they're setting conditions of pretrial release, but I think it reflects a lack of understanding that, like, if you're depriving somebody of liberty, should we go through a process to do that? Or should we just have a judge enter a large dollar figure on a docket entry without having a hearing or anything? And I think if presented with that, a lot of Ohioans would say, oh, well, let's do the hearing. Let's do the fair way. But that's not how it was framed in the ballot initiative. And so that's where we're at today. But like I said, I don't think that's the end of the story. Even though that's in the, part of the law now that we've got, individual jurisdictions, Cuyahoga County, the courts can still make decisions about how they want to structure their bail decisions in a way that is, fair, protects the community, doesn't unnecessarily detain people, and leads hopefully to better outcomes.